Hello and welcome to Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers
by writers
to keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Nick.
I'm Brent.
And I'm Will.
And the four of us are back. I was told before we got into this episode that we are going to be talking about horror again. I don't have a clear picture on what's going to be happening, which I'm kind of excited about, I'll be honest with you. So I'm going to hand it over to the person that wants to take the reins, and that is old Will Ralston here.
Hello.
Take it away, my friend.
Generally, horror doesn't have a clear picture in the beginning either, so that's kind of a good point.
That we're going to actually talk about that. So let's start with horror. I want each of you to give me a one-word answer of when you think of horror, what does that mean to you? One word. I will give my one word, which is really a combination of two. So I'll go first if everyone wants to think.
You're going first and then you're cheating by doing...
Well, that way so you guys can so you think.
Cheating.
Unless you have something. If you have something, let's go.
Cheater!
Go ahead, dude.
Okay. For me, it's childhood.
Interesting. I'm going to say tense.
I'm going to say unexplored.
Okay. I'm going to say insecurity.
So now we're each going to kind of unpack our one word, and we're going to go opposite. So we're going to start with Brent. Why did you choose the word insecurity?
Because I feel like horror so often speaks to the current moment and the insecurities that society is feeling about itself within that moment. So, for instance, like a lot of zombie horror is, a reaction to capitalism run amok and resources being used without any, concern for future use. Werewolves are often, tied into repressed emotions in this, sexual repression and all these things. And so I think like horror often speaks to, and I say society, but also to individual insecurities too, I think. And like, maybe even insecurities that the creator wants to explore. And so that's kind of why I went with that one.
I love it. And Nick, you said unexplored. So can you explain that?
Yeah, so this goes back to the concept of what are you afraid of the dark for? Like, why are you afraid of the dark? You're not afraid of the dark. You're afraid of what's in the dark. And I feel like horror is really, truly exploring those deep emotions that you don't have the safety net to explore on your own. So it's unexplored scaredness. That's not even a word, but I'm going to go with it.
I'll take it.
Okay. And Marshall, you picked the word tense. Talk to me about that.
Well, I don't know. Just going off what Nick was saying too, like there's a feeling when I know that I'm settling in to read or watch something in that genre. I know kind of if it's done well, I will feel a tension, right? And it's the kind of tension that you go into knowing that you're going to have, but it's something that is, I don't want to say like, oh, it's expected, but it's also like, I want that. That's why I'm sitting down with that. Like I can deal with it if I know it's coming. It's one thing to have somebody jump at you around the corner in real life. It's another thing to sit down with a horror novel and be like, okay, now I'm ready to feel what this author is wants to make me feel. And I think a lot of horror is emotion, and that tension, that kind of expected tension is something that is almost comforting about the genre too, because I know that's the feeling one of the many feelings I'm expected to have. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So I chose childhood partly because it kind of goes off to our last episode about the question that Brent asked about what stories scared you as a child and what stories scare you as an adult. But for me, childhood was literally horrific at times, feeling like you're an outsider, which I think horror can do really well, of like you're the only one, survival. but also because for me, the early things that I gravitated towards was horror. My sisters read Stephen King. I got introduced to Dean Koontz, Richard Lehman, Shirley Jackson, Tannereve Due. These were really things that I like soaked up. Christopher Pike, R.L. Stein, like really things that were frightening. And it took me a long time to realize, because I didn't really start reading any type of fantasy until a little bit later, probably until I was about 18. I never realized you could actually read something and not be frightened. Right. And like enjoy it, because that's how much like I enjoyed horror. But horror, I think also as a child and as a teenager allowed me to process trauma. So I'm going to just read some of the definition of horror. Horror, a noun, an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust. Children screamed in horror. A thing causing a feeling of fear, shock, or disgust, which is a plural noun, horrors. A literary or film genre concerned with arousing feelings of fear and horror. Intense dismay. A derogatory, it could mean something that's derogatory, right? So what is at the heart of horror? Like, what do you think horror means to you? Does it have to have a supernatural element? Does it need to have a psychological element? Does it need to have a monster of the week element? Nick.
I feel like this is going to be a two-part answer for me as I'm thinking about this. And my first initial thought was horror creates fear. And because there's certain things I can watch in the horror genre that doesn't scare me, doesn't induce any fear to me, but I know it does induce fear into other people. So for example, I don't do supernatural. Like I don't do demons and stuff like that. I believe in it. I've experienced stuff like that. So I don't mess with it. Like that's a no. But any type of serial killer, like anytime where it's a human harming another human, essentially for horror, I'm fine with it because I live by the concept. If I can kill it, I'm not scared. It means I always have a chance to survive. But supernatural, there's nothing you can do other than leave, and sometimes you can't even do that in a lot of these movies and things like that. And I will say within the genre of horror, there's so many different subsets that you're talking about. Is it supernatural? Is it, real life horror? Like, so I would have to divert to my first answer here actually is, does it induce fear?
Marshall.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I think that kind of depends on that. There are all the subsects of horror too, and Nick, you're right. Like my first thing is you kind of have to be scared, but like, okay, I'll throw something out to you guys because this doesn't necessarily scare me, and it's a whole genre of horror. And it was something you said in one of the definitions. You were saying that disgusts or something along the line. And what that made me think about was kind of the more slasher, the slasher stuff, like the more of the, gory stuff. Right. And like, to me, that kind of stuff doesn't necessarily bother me that much, So like, there's also the genre of, there's the campy horror stuff where it's like all just like chopping people up and stuff like that. That looks kind of almost silly. I'm not, I don't know if there's a fear there, but also it's playing on things that, like Nick was saying too, of like, if you can kill it, you can chop it up, like all these kind of things. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think inherently, yes, it's fear, but also when you jump into some of these other elements, like why do some folks, and I know some of my students for sure, they sit down and they can't wait to watch whatever it is, someone running around chopping somebody up, and it's not scary really, you know what I mean? But there's something about the act of looking at somebody doing something that you won't hopefully never see. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know where that fits in or if I'm answering your question, but at the core of it, it's fear. But then there's also like, what are some of the other things going on? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the supernatural part is a trip in and of itself. The psychological stuff is what gets me the most. That's why I like the things. That's why I like some of those more recent things, like the fall, the fall of House of Usher and stuff like that, because there was a couple moments there, but really it was more of a tension and a psychological thing than anything else.
Yeah. Brent.
So I guess for me, I would think, I think about, is it grotesque, disturbing, or unsettling outside of fear? Because I can recognize that something is meant to be unsettling and disturbing it without necessarily being scared by it. So I think about like the fall of the House of Usher, both the Netflix series and the original story. Like I was never actually scared with either one of those things, but it was deeply unsettling. It was very it was uncomfortable. And I think, I think horror can do those things too, where like it doesn't necessarily need to scare the shit out of you, but it leaves you with this sense of like, ooh, that was unpleasant, or like, that wasn't great, or so I think of Edgar Allan Poe a lot with this, right? Like a lot of his stuff is like not necessarily scary, but very, very disturbing. Like burying someone behind a wall while they're still
Oh
alive.
yeah.
That's deeply disturbing. And so yeah, I think I consider fear, of course, is one of those prime elements, but I think I also think about like, is it disturbing? Is it grotesque? Because sometimes body horror too is just like, it's just grotesque to be grotesque. It's not necessarily meant to like terrify you. So I consider like those three things outside of fear too when thinking about horror.
Well, and I like what you said too about the fact of that feeling of being unsettled. You know what I mean? Like there was at the end of a couple of those episodes, and like Kate and I kind of looked at each other like, "Fuck, okay, let's keep going." You know what I mean? It's like you sit in it for a second, you're like, God, that was kind of fucked up, right? Okay, yeah, but I want to see what happens next, because it's not like I'm not scared. Like there were a couple moments where she kind of like, in Fall of House of Usher, for example, like kind of, gripped my arm a little bit towards the end of the series, but for the most part, I was just like, God damn, that makes me feel weird, and I like it. Let's see how this plays out. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's the tension.
Yeah.
It's the tension that it creates within us that, and I think the thing about horror, and sometimes, Marshall, to your point about sometimes why people like watching these things that are just so like brutal, because one, it's not real, but it's also creating this tension, this physical response, and then you can release it. And for some people, it's probably their only form of exercise. Think about it. You're unable to maybe some people aren't able to exercise, right? But when you're watching something that gives you tension, right? That makes your heart beat a little faster, and then you release it. It's like it literally is releasing energy. And you're in a safe environment to experience these things. It feels real probably at times, but we all know that it's really not.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, exercise works here too.
Yeah.
Okay. You just said something, Will, that you and I've had a similar conversation on. You're in a safe space when it's happening. I will forever stand on this hill that dark romance that is just freaking effed up. We're like, oh, I fell in love with my stalker who was trying to kill me. That is mother loving horror. I'm sorry. That is horror romance, and it is what it is. And women love it because I do think they are in a safe space to explore that, where it doesn't actually have to happen to them, but it is a concept, right? I'm going to look, someone could talk me down the ledge or try to, but that's horror to me. That is horror romance, and I love how it's positioned not as that, because that shit sounds scary as hell to me.
I would also say that it's not just women though who like to read that.
Yeah.
It's men, non-binary, everyone. There's everyone. We tend to think it's just women, but the real truth of the matter is there is this, I'll have to link it so we can put it in the show notes. There's this really interesting article I read about a month ago about the rise of romanticy and this dark eroticism, of just what you were talking about, and the percentage of men that read it that wouldn't ever do these things, but it's living out this fantasy that, again, I think is safe. What were you going to say, Brent?
Well, I mean, just kind of expounding on what you said, like about exercise, and I was saying exorcise is an actual word here too, because I think that's what horror does. It allows you to release some of these like darker thoughts or these darker like ideas that you don't have anywhere else to explore or to see play out in any way. And it's like horror provides that space to like release that. It's almost cathartic in a way. You get like that release of like, because like, okay, how many times have like you've seen in the movie where someone gets something they deserve and you're like, fuck yeah, they had that coming. Like you wouldn't really do that in real life. For the most part, you really wouldn't do that when you see like someone get clobbered by a van in the street. Be like, yeah, they had that coming. But like in a horror movie, you get to have that ability to kind of like engage in a little more callousness, I guess, or an exploration of these darker ideas. So
yes.
Dude, okay, so you reminded me of two things. One, I'm watching Attack on Titan with my family, and we're in the final season, right? And like, there are moments of that show where like I found myself doing exactly what you just said, Brent. I'm like, I don't care if that kid's a child. Get rid of this kid. Like, this kid is awful, doing some horrible shit. You know what I mean?
Exactly who you're talking about.
And you know what I'm talking about. And I'm just like, I found myself rooting against this kid in a way. I'm like, this is something I would never do, but I feel like this child deserves it. This is some fucked up shit. You know what I mean? And so what I think is funny about horror and having this conversation and exploring those things you wouldn't normally do, and this is something I tell my students as well, but like, I love Mass Effect, Star Wars: The Old Republic, BioWare games where you can have that decision tree and you can make those decisions, right? And I tell people, and they don't, because I feel like I come across a pretty nice guy sometimes, but I tell people I almost always make the dark side decision. Almost always. Like, I wouldn't do that in real life, but I want to see how this shit plays out with my character. You know what I mean? Like, there's something about that I feel like that is horror adjacent almost, because sometimes I'm doing stuff that like, I don't know why this is a decision, but I kind of want to see how this plays out. You know what I mean?
I think that also goes down to like, I think it is important. Horror allows us to explore some of the darkness of being a human being.
Yeah.
Because we all have at times been like, well, you know what? There's a real life event that has happened that some people said, well, you got what you put out.
Yeah.
And I think, you try to come about it as a compassionate person, that you don't want anyone to go through that. But you can also see that sometimes you can understand why someone is coming from there, even though you really want to come out and say, no one deserves to be hurt. No one deserves that. I think what storytelling and reading and immersing yourself, it allows you to go on that journey. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we see when characters have killed someone that maybe, it felt like the right thing, right? Like you feel like, oh yeah, he got theirs. But then as that character goes through the journey and you're reading it or you're watching it, you start to see certain things, sometimes nothing. Sometimes you're like, well, yep, they deserved it. With certain characters, they needed it. Other times you're like, oh, now I can see what that actually did to you, to your soul. It's torn you up. Yeah. It's made you think, and let me go back to this though. At their most primal, horror stories are about survival. Whether it's survival of identity, free will, or physical life, set against a backdrop of isolation and pursued by a relentless menace that won't stop until the hero is dead. And some examples, The Exorcist, Halloween, The Walking Dead. We mentioned zombie movies, A Quiet Place, It, The Shining. I think those are just some type of examples of like what horror can do. And then you have genres that are mixing in horror elements, right? And I think what's really important too is there is a distinction between horror and dystopia, right?
Yeah.
Because dystopia a lot of times, I mean, we can talk about this. Dystopia is usually what white people feel suddenly. That's been happening to every single marginalized person, especially Black people. So there's a difference. Horror is, I would say, takes it a step further, you know, and, you know, your protagonist is literally in a fight for their life in those aspects. Any comments on that?
Amen to the dystopia definition, first of all. Just amen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So I also think too, like, I think sometimes in the horror, the survival is like you're surviving yourself, like surviving your own, like surviving your own demons and your own choices. Like there's this one movie, I don't know if you ever saw it. It's called High Tension, and it's this French horror movie. Absolutely so good. And I don't even I'm kind of scared to talk about it because I don't want to spoil, but
now let this be a spoilers episode.
Okay.
We can always watch it.
True. Okay, fine. So it's this French horror movie, and there's this girl. The whole time she's running from this slasher, and she's trying to protect her friend, and like she's having to save her friend out the van. She's having to take her friend, and they're running into the woods, into the cabin from this killer. Then they're having to run from the cabin into like someplace else. It's just like one thing after another. They're running from the slasher, and you never really hear her friend talk. Her friend is just like in this like state of horror the whole time, right? Oh, you get to the end of the movie, it has not been a slasher. She's been the slasher. She's been kidnapping her friend from place to place to place. Oh. She's the one that killed her friend's family. She doesn't realize it until the end that she disassociated, and she's been operating in two different realities this entire time.
God damn.
Oh, that's good.
It was so good. It was so good. Yeah.
Marsh.
Well, and I think, I don't know, and I brought this up last time, and there'll be a minor spoiler because I alluded to it last time. But I read Lone Woman by Victor Laval, right? I was talking about that book. And Will, something you were saying about running from something, and that goes along with what Brent was saying. Sometimes it's stuff that you're carrying with you or not dealing with, right? What I loved about Lone Woman is, you know, and you don't find out until much later in the book, but she's carrying around this giant trunk with her, right? And this woman is trying to move, you know, this Black woman is uprooting herself and moving to Montana alone, but she has to take this giant trunk with her. And every time someone tries to move the trunk, she's able to move the trunk okay, but no one else can seem to, I mean, it's a huge burden. It's so heavy, right? But what you're taking with you, or what the characters are taking with them in horror sometimes is the horrific part. You know what I mean? It's something that you're either trying to let go of, or something you're trying to deal with, or something you ultimately have to face, right? And that's another reason I like horror so much is, like Brent was saying, sometimes it's just something you're just freaking dealing with, or the character's dealing with and has to face. You know what I mean? I think that's the brilliant way of writing, one of the many ways you can write really, really good horror.
Nick, do you have anything? Yes, I knew you did. Go ahead.
Was there a question asked? I feel like we're all just having a really good conversation right now.
There was a question asked, but then we just went on a question of a question. I just asked what everyone thought about, you know,
the definitions.
Well, yeah, as like, you know, horror being the most primal about survival, whether it's survival of identity, free will, physical life, set against the backdrop of isolation and pursued by relentless menace that won't stop until the hero is dead.
I'm gonna bring up a movie, because I do want to I feel like this is going to be a deeper conversation too. So I'm really interested in the concept of internal processing of what's happening to you on the outside. So Marshall, you kind of alluded to that a little bit here, but the movie Sucker Punch with Emily Browning, and it is she's going through something horrible, but she goes into her mind to fight the demons. And it's something that, okay, throw it out there. I'm pretty sure our listeners know right now, or at least should or should not. I don't know. So I've had cancer 3 times and I struggle with PTSD at times as well. And there's always this concept I've had since I was a little kid of a storytelling aspect called the teddy bear nightmares. And for me, what that storyline is I fall asleep and my teddy bear wakes up and fights my demons for me while I'm asleep so I can rest peacefully, right? That's the concept. Sucker Punch actually made a movie of something similar like that, where the outside world is attacking the hero, if you will, or the main character, but they're processing it in a different channel of where they have power and control in there. Thoughts, I guess.
So thoughts on that for me is that is superhero with having horror elements. But I wouldn't say that is something strictly horror or the way it's framed is not psychological horror. There are horror elements though, because what those girls go through of being trapped in there, specifically for being women, is horrific. But I wouldn't frame that. I would say it's a merging of genres.
For sure. But it also, why is Freddy Krueger no different?
Yes, I would say Freddy Krueger. I would say Freddy Krueger is different in this aspect because the way that you look at the breath of that film is your breath work is constantly, oh my God, is this going to happen? Where with Sucker Punch, the breath work is more of a action-oriented film that kind of makes you think about the horror of being trapped. So to me, it felt more of like a breathwork issue, if that makes sense.
Go ahead, Brent.
I think how I felt at the end of both movies is also what makes it different. At the end of Sucker Punch, I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah. At the end of Freddy Krueger, I'm like, oh, thank God they made it. Like it's like 2 different vibes. It's like at the end of Freddy Krueger, you're just like, whoo, child, like this has been a whole fucking ordeal. And not to say that, with Sucker Punch it wasn't, but it felt more like a hoorah type idea, I guess, as opposed to like with the Freddy Krueger people. At no point did I feel like any of them really had a chance. Like they are fucked. Like Freddy Krueger is on their ass. And I think that for me that was probably like the difference.
Now, what's another thing to also like put with a grain of salt is that we are all male presenting and male identifying, right? So I think it's also would be interesting to hear from like a female perspective if Sucker Punch was something that was, did they walk away feeling that same feeling? That's what's really interesting sometimes is like your perspective of things.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead,
and it's one of those two. I'm not saying Sucker Punch is horror. I definitely think it is a genre blend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which is where do you draw? Where do we draw the line of what is horror?
We're actually going to talk about that next. We're going to do that next. Go ahead,
after Marshall talks.
Well, I don't know if what I'm going to say is going to help with that, but we're talking about blending genres a little bit, or you were saying it's superhero. I couldn't help. I had to think of The Boys, and the reason being is because if you've seen The Boys, there's so much horrificness in the show, but at the same time, what I like about it is there is an element with Homelander sometimes where you have that feeling of like what Brent said, he's on their ass. Like he's right there. He's going to be there. And like, how are we going to get away from this person? And sometimes it feels like there's no way you can, you know what I mean? And I know it's not horror. It's also funny. It's also an action thing. It's also superhero, but I like the horror elements of it. I like because there's the goriness, but also there is also the horrificness of, I don't guess, superhuman humans. I don't know. It shows a side of humanity that I think is a little scary. I don't, I was just talking because that just popped into my head. Whether it's relevant or not is what it is.
So I would really love to do an episode on this because I think the TV show sucks. The comic book is haunting. The comic book, because of the way that it's visually told,
I haven't read the comics.
It's way scarier.
Yeah.
And actually more pacing than the show, to me.
Okay.
And I think there's visual elements of why I think this is where I think sometimes comic books can be very hard to translate into a show. Because I say that The Boys, if I just watched The Boys by itself, I would probably really like it. But because I've read Garth Ennis's work and because I see the way that it was drawn, it's a totally different experience of how haunting that show is and gruesome. Yeah. But I want to get back to something. So I don't want everyone to think I'm just taking this out of nowhere. I've been reading about a lot of horror, and I think structure, and especially when you're learning structure, is really important. And shout out to our other side of the crew who is like contrary to structure. Okay, not going to name any names, LP or Samim, or maybe sometimes Jen and Shanghai, but I'm just saying, okay? Sometimes we have these debates like, we don't need structure, which is great. They don't need it. I do. And I think when you're first learning to write, I think having some sort of structure is important. And this is why I really love Save the Cat. Yes, I think you can totally break out those walls once you start understanding things, but I'm really taking this from the new book, Save the Cat Writes Horror, right?
I'm going to pick it up. I haven't read it yet.
The reason I picked it up was because of Daniel Jose Older, because I can't drop a first name. I was in his class and we really got into it talking. And he said, and he said the same thing. He was like, listen, I know we all want to like put our hands up and be like, no, structure, that's so formulaic. He was like, but there's a reason of, especially when you're writing your first draft, well, that can really help. And then you can subvert all that. So one of the parts in Blake Snyder's book, it's called The Monster in the House.
Okay.
A hero is trapped in some location or situation, aka the house, and must survive a monster, human or otherwise. Monster in the House stories are commonly found in horror movies, urban thrillers, or comedies about people or things that just won't go away. Some examples are Psycho, Jaws, The Conjuring, Insidious, The Exorcist, Get Out, It. Now, as you might guess, both from the description above and the title of the book, Monster in the House, or Myth, M-I-T-H for short, it is the stuff of horror movies, monsters in isolation, stories of survival. So there's three fundamental elements of Monster in the House stories. There's the monster, a house, and a sin that lets the monster in. A transgression that can include ignorance.
That's interesting.
So let's just think of that framework for a minute, right? A monster that is supernatural in its powers or even of its strength derives from insanity or determination, right? I think when I thought of this, I thought of Dean Koontz wrote a novel in the 90s called Intensity. It takes place in 24 hours, and this family is locked in the house with a serial killer. And it is like the novel is a master of, to me, breath work. Because you turn those pages so much that it's almost like it's hard to keep up with what's going on, because in that book there's very few moments where you take a rest. And let's think about that for a minute. a lot of times we're taught when we're writing is that there is a point where you need to give the reader like a break. But often in horror, it's so different. There isn't really a break, but there could be a stillness. Think about it. You're at this moment when you thought of the House of Usher, right? When you're thinking about the House of Usher and Kate's grabbing your arm, Marshall, right? And there's like, oh my gosh, there's this intensity. Nothing terrible is happening, but you're like, okay, we need to read more, right? So you're still not really letting the reader have a moment of peace. When we think of fantasy, and let's just say epic fantasy, there are these quiet moments that can still build tension, but not the tension the way that horror does, where it's leveling up on it. What are your thoughts on like that kind of explanation of like horror? Because that was me. That was not the book.
No, I think you're right. I think the moments I like how you said the stillness thing. Because when we're, I don't know, every writing class I've taken, even teaching classes, it's like you do want to figure out where to put the breaks. You want to figure out where to end a chapter. You want to figure out where to give the reader a time to kind of be like, take a deep breath and even put the book down if they want to, especially if you're talking epic fantasy. You got to give them a break at some point, But with horror though, I think you have to do that differently because you want to keep the tension ramping up, but you also want them to not suffocate from, from holding their breath the whole time. So how do you playing with the pacing? I think that's a pacing thing. I think it's a pacing and an attention thing for sure that you have to kind of massage as you write these things or rewrite these things or revise them. Right. I don't know.
Brent, what do you think?
I think I definitely agree with that. So I think like with horror, it's like even as one tension gets resolved, there's like three others coming. I think of like this is I think where horror soundtracks don't get enough credit for how much they do for the horror movies.
Oh,
because like you'll have that part where like someone's just drinking tea and you just hear this and you're like, oh fuck, what's about to happen?
Yeah.
or there'll be the moment where someone's like, cutting a piece of bread and you as the audience, and I think this is where horror, I think, in terms of tension differs from like epic fantasy and whatnot. I feel like in horror, the audience gets to see stuff before the characters do so much more often than in other types of stories. Like when you're watching horror, you're like, oh no, don't do that. Like, oh man, like that you didn't see that thing just crawl behind you, or like,
I know what's in there.
Like what's in there, and you're freaking out. So like, I think that adds to the tension too, because like you, the audience member, know so much more than the people what they're experiencing, and that knowledge I think often drives the tension, because like if you care for those characters, you're tense for them. Like, this isn't right. Like in I think of like Us, like in Us or whatever, you see the duplicates or whatever, they kill people before they get to the main characters. So you already know shit's about to get real. So when they show up, you're just like, holy hell, like what's happening? And I do think that's what I think that's where horror's tension works a little differently than in other genres, because the audience has so much more foreknowledge than what the characters have.
Nick, what are your thoughts on about?
I don't have any.
Okay.
But you can re-ask the question and I'll think again.
Well, I mean, it's about like stillness and breath, about how horror, in comparison to other genres, it doesn't necessarily give you, like, if you're reading an epic fantasy, right? And they're on a quest, there's these moments of action, and then there's this moments where you can have a moment where it can still move the plot forward, but they're like having a conversation with the character, or they have this moment of like where the reader can breathe. They're not just running all the time. When you think of horror, that tension is completely there in every single chapter to move the book.
Yeah. I like how we're using the phrase breathwork for that, because that's exactly what it does feel like when it's done correctly. Um, I mean, tackling that as a writer and trying to replicate what like a lot of the good horror genre writers do, I think that's where the masterclass is on this one, because there is a level of tension that you have to maintain the entire time, where the tension, when it does have a stillness, doesn't feel like, oh, everything's fine. You know what I mean? And I've struggled with that in my own writing. I think that's because you can intensify things as much as you want, but it's dropping that tension to a certain degree. I think that's where the magic is on this. And it has to be done, but it can't be done in a way where you feel that character is safe. They still have to feel unsafe, unsure, and still fearful.
Yeah. Go ahead, Marshall.
But I think that's I think that's exactly the way to phrase it, because you want to feel like in epic fantasy, for example, you know, when the characters all go to the tavern to chill after a big moment, like you know they're safe for a bit. You know what I mean? Like whatever's going on, you know, there's not something lurking in the darkness necessarily for them, because it's not the right, that genre doesn't necessarily do that as often. You know what I mean? But in horror, like Nick said, if you let the reader think the characters are safe too much, doesn't that change? I feel like that changes the genre. It makes it not a horror anymore. You want to keep that tension at a certain level, right? Or am I tripping?
No, I think yes. I think a great example of this is the movie Weapons. And I think also
I haven't seen that. I really want to see it.
It does also the book as well as the movie does this really well. You know, I think also The Fireman by Joe Hill is also another outstanding book of horror and tension and how to like you're like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? You want to know, but for me, Fireman, I fell in love with so many of those characters that I was like, please don't let anything happen, but I know something's going to happen. Nick.
So I was just thinking metaphorically about this, right? When it comes to tension in the horror genre. So I live in a very high elevation area, but parts of the state's super low elevation. So when it comes to tension and horror, I think a good way like that I'm going to start looking at it a little bit more, right, is when you're going up a mountain, right? There's peaks and valleys and there's summits and things like that. And that's where you got to keep that tension from where you started at the base of the mountain. At the beginning, the story is great, but along the ways, you are going to have different peaks and valleys. So you hit the summit at the tallest peak, and then you get to the other side. That's where I feel like horror is different, because the other side is a completely different landscape sometimes. You're not on the same elevation. You're not in the same area. You're not in the same things. You're just through the peaks and valleys, but now you're somewhere new. And I think that's what is interesting about the horror genre, because it does that so well.
I like that.
Okay. So I'm just going to go over this again real quick, because I would like us to do another episode on this, because I think horror can be infused in any type of writing, just like we talked earlier, where like Sucker Punch had horror elements, but it wasn't horror. So the monster in the house has the monster that is supernatural in its powers, even if its strength, determination, from insanity or determination. A house that traps the hero. It can include a family unit, an entire town, or even the world. A sin that lets the monster in. A transgression that can include ignorance. I think if anyone wants an example of the world, I think The Stand is a really great one. I think Chuck Wendig's, I think it's called The Wanderers. That is also another really great one that deals with the world. Go ahead, Marshall.
No, I was just gonna say I never commented on that aspect of what you said earlier, but I love the idea of that the sin is what's letting it in, the mistake or the transgression, whatever that looks like, is what is allowing the horror to come in. You know what I mean? And I know I keep using the same example because I literally just read it not for long ago, but Lone Woman, that's exactly how that plays out, is the fact that that is that box, that crate, that trunk she's carrying is in and of itself a sin in some way. You know what I mean? And that's what's letting the horror out. And I love, and when we had that conversation about sinners, you know what I mean? Like everybody is relatively safe in that building. But someone is gonna sin, someone's gonna fuck up and let that horror in. You know what I mean? And we had a long conversation about who that was and how that played out. And I just think it that's what makes horror so complex and compelling too. You know what I mean? It's like we had a 20-minute conversation about about was it Grace making that Grace making that mistake or sinning or whatever she decided, however you want to phrase it, and letting those vampires in. I just think it's a brilliant way of telling a story. Anyway, sorry, Brent, go ahead.
Brent.
Speaking of like sin, I guess I will think of the Reformatory by Tanana Revdu, and like how the horror isn't really the horror. Like the supernatural isn't the horror. It's the
warden.
It's the men, the white men, and unfortunately the black men that sat there and allowed these horrific things to be done to these young boys. And I love like how I think I may have mentioned this in the last episode. That book actually, I literally was flinching like I was watching a movie as I was reading parts of it. There was parts where I was reading it on the plane and I had to turn my head away and be like, okay, you can read this next paragraph. You can read it. Go back and like start reading it again. And it was so well done. But it does this thing that I think great horror does, where like it peels back, it uses the supernatural to actually reflect on the present and the actual reality that we're living in. And that book, you have a boy who's a haint, but the reason this boy is a haint is because he was murdered. He was murdered, and no one gave a shit. And and unfortunately, that was the reality for all of these boys that were trapped in this so-called school, where they were, basically subjected to the whims of this maniacal, horrific warden and the people that worked under him. So I would love to see that thing adapted. It would have to be done by a brilliant director. I'm thinking Ava DuVernay or someone of that caliber. But yeah, great book.
Yeah, that book is, and it took Tanarive 8 years to write that book.
Yeah.
Because it was so hard and painful, because there's a lot of history that she has with where she based that book from. Like she has relatives.
Yeah.
So before, this is going to be our last part because I'm going to read something. Okay. But I want to know just really quick, what makes a great either prologue or first chapter to get you ready for the horror novel? What are some elements that you can think of that really kind of like enwraps you into a story element of horror? I'll go to Nicholas first.
Technically, my name is Hold Your Horses, Will, but
that's true. That's true. For everyone who's not benefiting from the feed,
the video feed.
Hold Your Horses, Will, because Nick was late. Okay?
He was late.
I was doing a thing. So I think I divert to any basic story when it comes to this. Is the promises that are opening up in the beginning. What are the promises being made in the openings? Like, what kind of character am I following? Because if I'm gonna be honest, if it's character I don't like or feel like they kind of deserve it, I'm not gonna be scared. I'm gonna be cheering on the bad guy. I still think the basic element of having a character that you can care about or feel for is gonna be super important. But then, like, to tie in the horror side of things too, right? I want the tidbits. I want to hear about the news clipping of a murder or a story someone hears in passing about something supernatural and things like that. I want a nod to what I can expect. And I will say I'll go with the Dan Wells series. I'm not a serial killer. There's a twist in that. I mean, this spoiler fantastic episode, right? We can talk about spoilers.
Yeah, the book came out
Halfway through the book, you think this is something about a murder, but at the halfway point, supernatural enters. And it's such a jarring position to have supernatural be introduced halfway through that first book in this series that it throws a lot of people out. I think that might be one of the very few exceptions where like I continued on and was even more interested in the book, but it's very rare that I think you could introduce a different type of element like that without giving a hint or a nod to the beginning of that. Marjorie?
I was thinking of the same. I had the same example in my head, and that was because to answer your question, Will, what I thought of is what is the character's motivation to keep moving? And I think that's a lot of times with horror is, something being chased, something being contained, that kind of thing. And what I think worked for me with Dan Wells's book is the fact that I knew what was motivating that character. So when it shifted, I knew that they would step up and keep moving. You know what I mean? And like, that's kind of what I like about the genre. And, if you look at a lot of times someone is running from something, right? But I want to be invested in the reason that they're running and the reason they keep moving. Why don't they give up? I want to be there. I don't want to give up either as the viewer, as the reader. Right. And so I think that is the motivation to keep moving is a big part for me of why I like the genre so much, is because I'm tied to the character and I'm tied to, I want them to be okay, but also I want to feel like I can keep moving too when things go south. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Brent?
So for me, I kind of like when you get the unrelated character who gets fucked in the very beginning of the sequence. Like it's like, I don't know, like when like in Jeepers Creepers, when there's the random someone 23 years ago gets snatched the fuck up by Jeepers Creepers and is gone. Like, or like in Saw, you start off with someone's having to dig a key out of somebody's stomach. Like it's some crazy some crazy shit. Like I love to see like the random character that you aren't sure is going to have anything to do with the plot later, but it ends up having something to do with the plot, get screwed up by whatever supernatural force or killer or whatever in the beginning. And then you move into the calm of, oh, now we're going to turn to this unsuspecting couple who's just driving down the street where this monster 23 years ago snatched the little kid up. Like, I like that. I love that with horror. I like that.
Brent, you actually mentioned that earlier, that you do like that's part of the horror aspect to you, is the reader knows what's going to happen before the character does, and that is an element there.
Yeah, I love that tension. Like I'm like, oh, you people are going into the wrong hotel. Like,
I mean, I would also say that the beginning moments of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, best one ever, opens up exactly like that.
I knew you were going to bring up Scooby-Doo with the throat clearing. I just knew it.
Yes, because
I'll
it's
leave
literally
that
the best
clearing
thing
in for effect.
It's literally the best thing ever. Okay, so I'm going to read something from a book, and I'll tell you what it is afterwards. Okay. But for everyone who's listening, and to my 3 co-hosts, I want you to just think about beginnings and what this does really right, and what type of horror it could be evoking. Okay? So feeling what it's evoking, and, it's the beginning of a horror novel. Okay? The Guardian did it better. Lewis Dixon didn't know how long he had been staring at the newspaper in his hand. Long enough that the words didn't read like actual words, just a mixture of black smudges on the paper. Long enough for the antiseptic smell of the hospital waiting area to turn his nostrils numb. He looked up, following the voice to its owner. He drank in her visage, bathing in the starkness of her blonde, short-cut hair. The tall, lanky frame and the high cheekbones and warm, bright blue eyes burned into his mind. He would remember her. As a painter, he enjoyed people. They were always his favorite thing to immortalize within his art. It was ironic, really, because he found himself born a few centuries too late to capitalize on the skill. No one in the 21st century was paying for elegantly done portraits. And yet, if he had found a way to cut in line before God, Buddha, or whoever had punched him into earth, he would have made a killing. Or at least, probably far more than he made now. He brought his thoughts back to this woman. A new thought struck him. She's not someone who seems like they should be in this hospital. Too privileged. Too perfect in the way she spoke. The article you're reading, she said, gesturing with one hand that held a coffee cup. The oligarch and his family found dead in Russia, frozen inside their home even though no doors or windows were open. The Guardian had a segment on it, already interviewing Russian sources. That sounds dangerous. Russia is not a bastion of free speech, he replied. He didn't want to talk, and he knew his words sounded hollow. He might love the idea of people as an artistic concept, but this wasn't really the moment he wanted to explore that. And yet, responding was the respectful thing to do. His mother, who was in a hospital room halfway down the hall, would have wanted him to. Besides, he would be lying if he didn't admit how interested he was in his roommate at MedStar Harbor Hospital in downtown Baltimore. Elegant, refined, the type of person whose consonants were polished round from good breeding and the right type of education the wrong type of money could buy. Those types didn't find their way to Baltimore. Definitely not this part of Baltimore. Washington, D.C.? Sure, but never Charm City. That, in and of itself, meant there was a story here. And there wasn't an artist alive who didn't love a good story wrapped around a beautiful muse. Agreed, but isn't journalism supposed to report the truth no matter the consequences? I suppose, he said, sidestepping the earnestness her declaration tried to stab him with. Who are you here for? Maybe they could bond over that. The problem was, again, that Lewis didn't particularly want to bond. More, Lewis knew what would happen next. She would tell him, he would sympathize, and then she would ask the same question in return. He would have to explain that his mother had tried to call his father, who hadn't answered because he was on a work trip, because she felt funny, how she passed out while dialing Lewis after leaving a voicemail for his father, and when the ambulance came, blood was pouring out of her eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. An aneurysm, they said. Nothing like they've seen before, but it was the only logical explanation. He would have to tell the stranger the doctors didn't seem confident about that. But the answer the woman gave, that was a surprise. I'm a donor here, she said. A blood donor? That would explain it. For a relative, of course. She wouldn't be caught dead in some place like this otherwise. She laughed, light, like a flint crackling. It sometimes feels like blood. But no, money. We had a board meeting in the attached wing and it ended early. I'm waiting for my Uber. You wait for your Ubers in the hospital waiting rooms. I'd like to see what my money is going toward. She smiled, a row of perfect, pearly white teeth shimmering back at him. Whoever you're here for, I'm sorry. Another unexpected reply. How much did he want to tell this woman? That he had missed his mother's call, her final attempt to reach out for help, that he only found out she was dead because his father called over and over and over? No, she didn't need to know that much. He would never see this woman again. My mother, he said after a moment, leaning back in his chair and pulling his black hoodie down from around his head. She's dead. No one said it like that. Even the doctors danced around the crudeness and bluntness of the word, like if they waited until they could pick up some telltale sign he was ready. Then when they actually said the word dead, it wouldn't hit as hard. It would always hit that hard, because in the littlest or biggest, the wildest or thinnest of ways, her death was his fault. If he hadn't been obsessed with that painting, maybe he wouldn't have missed her earlier call that afternoon and could have been there when the aneurysm burst. Of course, it wasn't as if there was much he could have done, but at least he would have been there. At least she wouldn't have been alone. Except that was never an option, because it wasn't just any painting that kept him busy for the whole day, missing his mother's call by 4 hours, but one of his fugue paintings. That's what they called them. They always started with a tingle in the back of his head, then an itch he couldn't help but scratch that, if it ignored for too long, turned into a headache, blinding, terrible, debilitating. But once he sat down and gave in, the euphoria of letting his fingers take the brush, mix the colors, and let go was unmatched. Time moved quicker when he painted like that, and not in the way most artists described. In what felt like a second, he would have a painting. And often that painting would come true, which was something he definitely didn't want to get into with this random person, let alone at this particular moment. "Oh, Louis," the woman said softly, reaching over too gently, put her hand on the back of his. "I'm so sorry. Your mother was a wonderfully talented woman." "Thanks. I should have been there, should have answered her call. I wanted to tell her in person that evening, but..." Louis blinked, suddenly yanking his hand from under the woman's touch. He wanted to finish his sentence with the invitation from the British Museum, but... "I never told you my name." The woman blinked slowly. "I'm sorry?" "You called me Louis." Then his face scrunched up as he chewed on something else. She said, "And you said my mother was wonderfully talented woman." "Yes. I never told you anything about her. How could you know that?" The woman's beautiful features, almost like polished porcelain, darkened as her wide doe eyes lidded slightly. Her open mouth closed into a tight line, making her cheeks more pronounced as she sighed and ran her right hand through her hair. "I slipped up," she said. "Again, I really need to get better at remembering what you do and do not know." Every cell in Louis's body told him to move. In fact, he ordered himself, screamed inside his head, to get up, walk towards the nurse's desk, and warn them about the woman in the suit that probably cost more than his whole year's salary as a part-time art teacher. But his body wouldn't move, as if the commands were lost somewhere in the delivery. The woman slowly turned her body towards Louis and leaned in to press her lips against his right ear. To anyone watching, it would look like she was telling him a secret. "I lied," she whispered, with soft hints of lilac wafting off of her. "Your mother wasn't a talent. She was a worthless fraud. And if I could kill her again, I would. I'll just have to settle for you once you're done with what your mother was unable to do for me." Fear bubbled inside Louis like a geyser. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do something in response to those words. He wanted to question her, punch her, demand she tell him she was lying or telling the truth or something in between. But something had a hold on him, keeping him glued to the seat. And every time he tried to move, it felt like barbed wire was tightening, not around his body, but his soul, hurting him so deeply he wasn't sure the pain would ever go away. But for now, mourn your mother, the woman said, and pack your bag. You're heading to London soon. I've heard it's beautiful this time of year. Louis gasped as, with a snap of her fingers, the restriction and pain disappeared in a microsecond. It wasn't nothingness that replaced the empty feeling, though it was something else, something like longing, something cavernous and missing. What had he just been talking about with the stranger in the seat next to him? "Sorry," Louis said, flashing her a hesitant smile. Have we met? She was beautiful after all. The tall, lanky frame and high cheekbones and warm, bright blue eyes were burned into his mind. He would remember her. The woman returned the smile. She had a kind face and seemed like the type of person his mother would have liked to have known. No, we haven't, she said, extending her hand. I'm Cassandra. It's a pleasure to meet you. Okay. Thoughts? Brent.
Okay, so that's exactly what I mean by like unsettling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that is so unsettling. Like especially when she said that line, like, "Oh, I forget what you know and don't know." I was like, wait a minute, like, And then when it got back to when like she was just straight up by his mom, like she was worthless and blah blah blah. And what I liked is the like. Clearly, what she wants is some kind of painting, because that goes right back to his whole fugue state that he can't pull away from. Mm-hmm. But I just like what I really liked prose wise was the repetition of his description of her once he forgot.
Yeah.
Like,
that was
sick. He's described the exact same way. That's literally what I mean by like it doesn't have to be so much terrifying, but just unsettling. Like that is so unsettling.
And the unsettling part too, especially towards the end, is like, oh, I would remember her. It's like, bro, you clearly you're not remembering shit.
Yeah.
I don't know. That was really cool. Really nice.
Nick,
was that the opening of something?
It is. I'll tell you what it is in a minute.
Yeah. Okay.
Nick, what did you think?
So it has me wanting more. And that's where it's like, there's elements in the beginning where like you said a few things. I was like, well, that's a weird way to phrase that. And then I was like, okay, I need to keep listening because I'm catching on to the wrong things and I know it. And then just as you're sliding into the end, you're just setting up the premise, and that's what I really like. I look forward to when it comes to this.
Yeah. So it is from Kosako Jackson's The Macabre. And the reason I chose it was because it is about art. And what drew me in is because I do paint. And I have done a lot of figure painting. There was such a specificity to Lewis's describing of how he paints, and then it became even more unsettling as the story went on. So this really drew me in, and I just kept reading a bunch of first chapters or prologues from horror. And because this is newer, I was like, and one, it's just brilliantly done.
Really well.
I thought this was a really great way to just wrap up the episode.
I love it.
And it gives you really like strong thoughts about like how you can set up your horror novel or horror elements in a novel.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.